Hi, I'm Saskia van Nouhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Indian Institute of Science in the Center for Ecological Sciences. And just a little bit about me, because this is the first lecture that I'm going to be giving. I study population ecology and community ecology in terrestrial systems, and mostly I focus on insects and the plants that the insects are feeding on, and then the insects that are feeding on the insects feeding on the plants. So looking at multi-trophic interactions and how species interactions affect populations and how they affect communities. And the lecture that I'm going to give today is about spatial population ecology. And it follows from the previous few lectures that you've had, which are also about populations. So in the last few lectures, you've been learning about what is a population and what causes population sizes to differ, and how to quantify changes in population over time. So population growth rates and what affects population growth rate. And the next two lectures, which I'm going to give, are building on that and saying, well, populations are changing in time, but they're also changing in space, meaning that populations exist in a landscape or in a seascape or wherever they live, and that individuals are spread over space and populations are spread over space. So, and that varies. If it varies, how they're spread over space varies in time, and also at different points in space, the population sizes are different and are changing in different directions. So that's what we're doing in these next two lectures. So before we start that, let's just think about the spatial environment that populations live in. So we can think about the sort of how environments vary on different scales. So on a very large scale, say the scale of the Indian subcontinent, we can see that environments are different largely due to weather, whether they're coastal, whether they're in the mountains, whether they have a lot of rain, whether it's dry, and these are depicted by these different colors in this map. And so that's large-scale variation in the environment, and if we think about the organisms that live in the environment, that's the scale that we talk about, sort of the species ranges. You know, what's the range of a species depending on the environmental situation that it can tolerate. If we think on a smaller scale, we look within one of these colored areas, then we also see variation in the habitat. And so for example, in this picture, we see city, we see trees, we see open grazed grassland. And then if we go to smaller scale, we see an actual bit of grassland and we see some animals in it. And there's variation at all these different scales. The scale that, what I'm talking about now is these two scales, not this larger scale. So not about the ranges that a species can exist in, but within a range, the variation in the habitat and the variation of the distribution of the species, or of the individuals. So if you look at pretty much any, maybe not any habitat, but almost any habitat, there's some heterogeneity. So if we look in this picture, if you say you're an insect that lives under rocks, then there's lots of rocks here, and so you could live under many of these rocks, but in between the rocks there's unsuitable habitat. And so overall this whole area is heterogeneous. You can't live over here in these bushes, you can't live in this water. This rock is kind of isolated from these other rocks, so for you as a under rock dweller, this is a heterogeneous environment. Similarly, if you say you're algae, if you're and you live in this water, we might think, okay, this pond here is all about the same. Maybe we think, oh, maybe it's homogeneous, meaning everywhere you go in it is about the same. But of course that's not true. The temperature is different where it's shallower than where it's deeper. There might be more or less oxygen in different parts of it. There might be fish in some places and not other places. And so if you're algae, then it would be actually kind of a heterogeneous environment for you as well. So pretty much every environment is heterogeneous to some extent. And we can think about that also at a much smaller scale. So this is a cartoon, and we see three different scenarios. One is, one is the, so these are all in the soil, and so in this first picture, it's soil particles that are big, these big gray circles, with bacteria, which are the little colored circles, living between the soil particles. And if the soil particles are smaller, then there's different bacteria represented by different colors that like to live or do the best in the soil that has smaller particles. And then if you have an environment that has big particles and small particles, then you have the bacteria from here and here. So you have the blue bacteria and the red and orange bacteria living in this heterogeneous environment. So on a large scale, we can see environmental heterogeneity, and then on a smaller scale, for smaller types of organisms like bacteria, they are also in a heterogeneous environment. So the heterogeneity scales with the scale of the organism kind of at all levels. Another thing that affects where are individuals in the environment, besides the heterogeneity of the environment, is the mobility or the dispersal ability of the species. So here's this picture. First, I'm just showing some seeds, which are the sort of dispersal aspect of many plants. And so how far individual plants get from their origin might depend on how well they're adapted to moving in the wind. These seeds over here can go long distances in the wind, so they would have a different distribution in the landscape than a species that just has, the seed just falls down right next to the tree and doesn't move. Some seeds are dispersed by animals, and so depending on the dispersal ability or the dispersal behavior of the animals, that affects where in the landscape that plant can be. So the dispersal abilities and the dispersal behaviors affect where species are. Of course, this is also true for animals. So in this picture, we're looking at the dispersal kernels for several different small carnivore mammals that share a landscape. And so we see this pine marten. Most of the individuals stay very close. They don't move very much. So this is a distance of 4 kilometers. So most of them are just, within 100 meters. They don't move around at all, but some of them move a little bit, and the dispersal kernel has this steep slope, versus the red fox, which actually has this kind of very spread out dispersal. Some individuals stay in one place, and some individuals move a lot. And so this again dictates how are they going to use a heterogeneous or homogeneous landscape. Another thing that affects where species are in landscapes is barriers to dispersal. So there's the innate ability or the dispersal or the innate dispersal behavior of species, but then there's also, are there things in the way? And so depending on what kind of organism it is, different things are dispersal barriers. So for many organisms, a road is a dispersal barrier. So there can be suitable landscape on this side of the road and suitable landscape on this side of the road, but individuals can't cross that road. Similarly, a dam for an aquatic species can limit the access between two water bodies. A river can be a dispersal barrier for terrestrial species. Or mountains can be dispersal barriers. Some of these things, such as the roads or the rivers, can also be dispersal conduits, so they can actually aid in dispersal. So depending again on what kind of species it is. Roads are dispersal conduits for people. And also other kinds of organisms who, say, fly or walk along roads. Those can be, so it can either be a conduit or a barrier, depending on the kind of species it is. Okay. So keeping those things in the back of your mind, let's just look at some hypothetical types of landscapes and species. So one way that I like to do it is by characterizing the situation in terms of connectivity of the habitat. And so high connectivity habitat is this area in which all of the habitat is pretty much equally suitable. It's all suitable for the species we're thinking about. And there's a lot of continuity, meaning species can easily move within that landscape. And then low connectivity was sort of the opposite, where depending on the attributes of the landscape and the dispersal abilities of the species, individuals can't get very well to the different parts of the landscape. Okay, and there's sort of, then there's different situations within this gradient of, gradient of connectivity. And I'm going to talk about each of these 4 different scenarios. So, just as a reminder, the structure and the dynamics that I'm talking about result from the distribution of the resource in the landscape. So say if you live in the forest, it would be the distribution of forest. The mobility of the species, can they just like jump around all over the landscape to the different forest parts, or are they sort of stuck in one forest patch? The variability of the environment, maybe there's a lot of change going on, or maybe it's very stable in one way and things have a long time to get to sort of colonize places. And then things that are happening within the landscape, so interactions between species, those of course affect the suitability of the landscape for the species. And then, since in some of these cases we're talking about relatively small population, there's demographic stochasticity that will affect the occupancy of the landscape by the species. And by that I mean that if a population is small, then by chance sometimes it can do well and sometimes it can do poorly, and sometimes it can do so poorly that it can disappear from the landscape. And then I want to note again that this concept of connectivity is an attribute of the landscape and also the species. So the same landscape will have a different connectivity depending on the species mobility, right? So for a bacteria, a forest for a bacteria is much different than a forest for a bird of prey that flies all around. So they have different experiences of connectivity. And then finally, also, these things that I'm talking about have a lot to do with people, which I'll hint at later. Okay, so we'll start with the sort of simplest one, and this is kind of hypothetical. So the continuous landscape. So in this situation, the whole habitat is equally suitable for a hypothetical species. And it's all equally accessible, and it's used. So anywhere in this habitat, individuals could be living and feeding. And there's no particular limitation to interactions among individuals in the landscape. So we can look at a big grassland like this, and for some grazing species, this is a pretty uniform landscape, and we can call the populations that live in it continuous. But we might ask, okay, say that there's some grazing vertebrate grazers that are in this grassland. How do we think they're distributed in the grassland? So we said it's all equally suitable. Does that mean that they're distributed, individuals are distributed randomly in the landscape? Or does it mean that they're distributed uniformly, they're all 5 meters apart? Or does it mean that they're clumped? So it's not information about the landscape in this case that's telling us how their distribution might be. What tells us about their distribution in this scenario is their behavior. So since most of these vertebrate grazers are social, we expect them to be clumped. So within this uniformly suitable habitat, virtually uniformly suitable, we'll find clumps of individuals of a species within there. If we were finding random distribution or uniform distribution, then that would tell us something else, either about the species For example, if they're uniformly distributed, we might think, oh, they're territorial and they're getting as far apart from each other as possible. Or if they're randomly distributed, then we might be thinking they're completely non-social. And so we might think different things if we looked at their distribution in this uniform landscape. The second kind of landscape I'm going to talk about is pretty close to this one, and I'll call it a patchy habitat. And in this case, so all of these little stone-shaped things are suitable for the species, and they are occupied by the species. And so there's a suitable habitat embedded in an unsuitable matrix. And the habitat is mostly accessible and mostly used, and there's limited interactions. There's low limitation to interactions among the species. So an example of that for some kinds of species might be mangroves. So say arthropods, maybe insects or insects relatives who live on mangroves, they might sort of occupy individual mangroves, but they can get among them, but there's unsuitable habitat, water, in between. So that's an example of a patchy environment. Next we go to a landscape style which has various different names. So we might call it mainland island or source sink or core satellite. Those basically mean about the same things. And the cartoon of it is here. There's one habitat patch, say, or some habitat patches, which is very suitable habitat. It's a good habitat. And then there's other habitat patches which are not such good habitats. And so especially if we're thinking specifically classically source sink, then in some habitat patches, they're very high quality and population growth rate in those habitat patches is high. And so they're a source of migrants to other places. Versus other habitat patches which are low quality, and the population growth rate in those is negative. So they're declining. So that's why we call it source sink. Some populations give off immigrants and some populations receive them. And so in this case, again, habitats differ in quality, and the occupancy of the lower quality habitat patches depends on the existence of the source patches. And I'll give you an example of that. So this example is looking at a mayfly. So mayflies, adults fly around, they look like this creature, and they lay their eggs in water, and then the immatures grow up in the water. So the immatures are aquatic. So this is a watershed in the Rocky Mountains in the United States, and it has lakes along the watershed. And some of these lakes, the ones that are colored black, so this one, this one, this one, this one, have trout in them, fish. And some of the lakes, the ones that are white, this one, this one, this one, don't have any fish in them. So in this system, the fishless ponds are a source of mayflies, and the ponds that have fish are a sink. So you might find mayfly babies in all of these ponds, but if you keep track of things, which this person, Chris Caudell, did, then you would find that almost all the individuals are coming from the fishless ponds, and they lay some of their eggs in the fish ponds, but very few of those eggs ever succeed because they get eaten by the fish. So this is a source sink system. And if you don't know, if you say you didn't notice which has fish and which wouldn't, you wouldn't know that there was good patches and bad patches until you investigate what's going on in the patch. Okay, so we did continuous, patchy, source sink, or mainland island, and then we get to metapopulation. And so in a metapopulation is a very dynamic system in which all of the habitat patches are suitable, but the species is limited in its dispersal ability or its dispersal behavior. So they tend to stay in the same places that they started in, and they're very small local so there's very small local populations inside of the big metapopulation, and these small local populations live for an amount of time and go extinct, but new ones are colonized. And so you say that as a whole, this whole set persists as a metapopulation made up of local populations that are not very stable. So this is a very dynamic situation. And I'm going to, in the next lecture, give you a case study that we go into much more detail in the concept of metapopulation processes. So that's all I'm going to say about that right now. So the next one is, this is the most exciting, or else the most sad or the most exciting, which is the non-equilibrium landscape. And so this is when the population is either declining or increasing in the habitat. So you arrive at the habitat and you arrived in the area and you find just, individuals in a few places. You don't know, did they just arrive there and they're spreading, or did it used to be much bigger and it's getting smaller? And so, and in fact, you don't even know if it's non-equilibrium. If you just go visit at one time, then you can't see if it's changing or not. So in order to see whether something is non-equilibrium, you actually have to visit over time. Or you have to have some sort of genetic measure of what's been happening over time in the landscape. So when we talk about non-equilibrium populations, mostly we talk about them being non-equilibrium due to habitat fragmentation. So we talk about them because they're declining. So they used to be stable and now they're declining, and that's due to habitat degradation, say due to habitat fragmentation. And an important concept when we think about conservation is the concept of extinction debt. And so if we think about a habitat that is becoming fragmented, say where its deforestation is happening, or where urbanization is spreading into the surrounding environment, something like that, then there are parts of the habitat that we find whatever species we're interested in, we find them there. And we know that fragmentation has been happening, but we don't know what the cost of that fragmentation is on that species if we just sort of survey at one time. And so when fragmentation happens, it's not like all the species die, right? They're still there in the fragments. The question is, over time, over generations, can the landscape that's fragmented support the species? And so the notion of extinction debt is to make us think about that in a fragmented environment, there are species that are present, but they're doomed to be locally extinct. So I'm talking about extinction from the local environment, not necessarily extinction of the species from the world, unless it's a very small endemic species. So this is just local extinction. So they're present, we can survey them, but they can't persist because of habitat degradation. And so that's extinction debt. And so I'll explain that a little bit more in this picture. So imagine, now I've been talking about species, now I'm going to talk about species richness, so the number of species in a habitat, which is closely related to how well a species is doing. So on the vertical axis, we see increasing species richness, and on the horizontal axis, we see over time. So at the beginning of this picture, the species richness is high. And then there's some kind of habitat loss due to fragmentation. And then, so that thing, maybe it's a one-time event. 1/3 of the habitat is taken away. Then over time, the species richness declines because that habitat can now has less suitable area for those species, and so there's less of them there. And if the species is a long-lived species, the decline is is slow. But if the species is a short-lived species, then the decline is faster, right? So trees that live 100 years can exist in a really fragmented landscape for, a couple of generations of people. But the offspring of those trees aren't regenerating. And so that would be the long-lived scenario. Okay. So lots of times when we see habitat fragmentation, we wonder what's the level of extinction debt that is present in that landscape. Okay. So I just characterized different types of landscapes / species in landscapes depending on their connectivity. But there's a couple of other ways I want to bring up how we think about species in landscapes. So one of the things we think about is the spatial synchrony of the population dynamics of species. So what I mean by that is, as in previous lectures, in any one place, a population can be growing, or it can be declining, or if you look over time, it could be cycling, or it could be sort of staying the same size. So at any one place, that could be happening. And often we're not even thinking about the location. We're just looking at the population size. But if we look in different places, then we look at, say, at the same species on different islands, or the same species in different locations. They may be going up and down together, or they may be going up and down independently. So that together or independently, we refer to as the degree of spatial synchrony of the population dynamics of the species. So if they're spatially synchronized, then species that are in two geographical locations are changing in population size over time together. And if they're spatially unsynchronized, then they're doing it in an unrelated way. Okay, so what causes them to be synchronized or not synchronized? So one of the reasons is dispersal. So I may say, oh yeah, they're in different geographical places, but actually it's the same population and they're very mobile, but I don't know it. So what I'm watching is actually the same population, but I'm calling it two. That would be a lot if there's a lot of dispersal. Another thing is that they may change together due to common weather. So they have the same conditions, and so they change the same way. So it could be common weather, it could be shared disease, they could be suffering from the same disease at the same time, or shared enemies. So these kinds of things can synchronize populations which are geographically separate from each other. So here's an example of this. So here are two butterfly species in the lowland and in the mountains in the Sierra Nevada and California. So looking at this one species first, at these different sites, it's sampled between 1999 and 2013. And some years it's doing well, and some years it's doing poorly. But among all these sites, high on the mountain and in the lowland, they're going up and down the different sites pretty much together. Okay, so they're spatially synchronized. And now, in this case, that is probably because they're extremely mobile and they move around in this whole scale together, and that's why they're spatially synchronized. Versus this other butterfly, where all the blue ones are moving over time, they go up and down together, and all the orange, yellowy ones all are moving together, but the blue ones and the orange ones are not synchronized. So that means that down in the lowlands, these butterflies are synchronized, and up in the mountains, they're synchronized, but the mountains and the lowlands aren't synchronized with each other. So for this butterfly species, this one is not very mobile. And so probably the lowland ones are synchronized by common weather, and the highland ones are synchronized by common weather, but they don't end up being synchronized with each other. Okay. So that's spatial synchrony. And one of the things people investigate is, what's the scale of spatial synchrony? How far apart do you go until you find that species are not, the species population sizes are not varying together? And the other thing people study is why are they varying together or why are they not varying together? Okay. Then the last aspect of spatial ecology I want to talk about is the field of landscape ecology. So landscape ecologists study the relationship between ecological processes in the environment and particular landscapes. So by environment, I mean the specific geographic features. So they could be rivers, they could be mountains, it could be Bangalore, it could be a city, it could be farms, types of, say, grassland versus forest. And so that's the environment. And then the things, the ecology that's studied in that environment might be the abundance of any particular species, biodiversity, the structure of communities, species traits, these things that ecologists study in particular landscapes. One of the ways that people quantify things in this type of study is by going to a region that going to a region and characterizing little samples of the landscapes in that region. So here in this picture we see an area that's divided into yellow, which is grassland, and green, which is forest. And in these different little circles, we have different proportions of forest and grassland. So where there's different, and then we can ask, these ecological things. What's the abundance of butterflies depending on the amount of grassland? Or what's the abundance of deer depending on the amount of forest? Something like that. And this is a way to quantitatively compare landscape attributes. Okay. Related to that is, I just showed you these circles which have some size, maybe 1 kilometer radius. But we can also ask, what size circle best is important for a particular species or even a particular trait of a species? So for example, if I'm looking at the frogs, say, in these red dots, if I want to know if those frogs are doing well at the red dots, how big a circle, due to forest, say, how big a circle do I need to look at? Meaning, does a frog need to have a lot of forest around it, 5 kilometers of forest around it, or does it just need to have 1 kilometer of forest around it, or 100 meters of forest around it? So it's saying, what's the spatial scale that is important to look at to understand the importance of the environment for that species? So again, this is a conservation issue, because we might want to say, how big an area do we need to conserve in order to facilitate the persistence of some sets of species? And so we want to know, okay, well, how big in an area is important for them? So here's an example. So this is a frog, and the researchers, Morgada et al. In 2019, were interested in the importance of amount of forest and road density on how well the frogs were doing. And so in this case, more forest, they imagine, is good, and less road, they imagine, is good. So roads are often dispersal barriers for frogs. Okay, so they went to this landscape. You can see all these gray roads and green forest, and they went to a bunch of places, these black dots, and they looked at the abundance and the fecundity, meaning the number of babies that frogs were having at each of these black dots, and then they characterized the landscape around it. And then they said, what's the landscape like around places where the frogs are doing well versus the landscape around places where the frogs are doing poorly? Okay, and so these are the data. It might be a little bit complicated to understand, but I'll go through it. Okay. So this is landscape radius, so the size of these like concentric circles. And then this is the road and the forest. So, and this is, we'll just start out with fecundity. So how many offspring, how well are the frogs doing in terms of number of offspring that they're having? And so what we see is that, and And then AIC, this is a way of comparing statistical models. And so a statistical model with a low AIC value means that the data, model is a good fit to those data. And so what we're looking for is a low AIC value. So what we see here is that road density at a scale of a little over 2 kilometers affects the fecundity the most. So that means that if there's not very many roads at a scale of 2 kilometers, then they will have high fecundity. Then looking at the proportion of forest and fecundity, we see that the fecundity is highest when the proportion of forest at a very small spatial scale, so less than a half a kilometer, when the proportion of forest is high at a very small spatial scale, then those frogs that are there have a high fecundity. Okay, so that's fecundity, that's how many babies they're having. This is sort of different than abundance, which is just how many frogs do you find there. So if we look at how many frogs you find there, we see that road density was important for fecundity at a scale of 2 kilometers, but in terms of just abundance, being related to abundance, it's actually less than a half a kilometer, meaning that if there's a lot of roads in the immediate surroundings, then there's low frog abundance. Then we can say, with respect to forest, the abundance of frogs is highest if we look at situations in which the density of forest in a large spatial scale, 3 kilometers, is highest. So the forest effect is on a large scale, the road effect is on a small scale. Okay, so we can look at this thing and then we can say, okay, we saw all these circles which have different amounts of forest and roads at different concentric circles, and then we analyze it by looking at these statistical models and seeing which statistical model fits at which spatial scale. Okay, and we conclude. The spatial scale for the spatial scale for the best model was different for different response variables. The response variables are the fecundity and the abundance and the occurrence. And they weren't exactly how the researchers predicted. But that road density and the forest proportion don't have the same spatial scale effects. So this actually makes it pretty complicated if you're trying to think about conservation of the frogs, because it depends on what you're measuring about the frogs, and it depends on what you're measuring, roads or forests. So it makes thinking about conservation quite complex. On the other hand, it gives you a really good snapshot about what's going on for the frogs. All right. So those are all of the ways that I'm talking about spatial ecology today. So first I talked about causes of spatial structure, and that was mostly about habitat heterogeneity, different scales of habitat heterogeneity, dispersal ability of species, barriers to dispersal. Those all affect where individuals are in the landscape. Then I talked about types of spatial scale, and that was that continuum of connectivity where the environment is continuously good until the environment is pretty much unoccupied, and you don't know whether it's unoccupied because it's being colonized or because it's declining. So it's a non-equilibrium set and everything in between. And then I took a little detour into talking about the effects of habitat fragmentation, and that when habitats become fragmented, it's quite difficult to be able to tell whether what the effect of the fragmentation has for a long time, because it takes a long time for species to decline due to fragmentation, and you don't know where they're going to decline to. And that's called extinction debt. And then I talked about two other aspects of habitat, sort of spatial ecology. One of them is the concept of spatial synchrony of population dynamics. So that's looking at what causes populations that are in geographically different places to change in size together or to not change in size together. And then I talked about landscape ecology. And in particular, when people are looking at very specific landscapes, how do you quantify differences between very specific landscapes? All right, and so then next lecture is going to be a case study on a research project that I've worked on for a long time, which is a butterfly in a fragmented landscape which has a classical metapopulation structure. So the metapopulation structure is the most dynamic of the ones that we talked about, where local populations are continuously becoming extinct and new ones are being colonized. And as a system, it persists due to all these local extinctions and colonizations. So that's what I'll talk about next time.